Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our while loops in Matlab. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on the fundamentals of the Matlab programming language. And specifically in this video, we are going to focus on how we can use a while loop, the syntax, and also how to drive it. In this case, using a different method than simply a single scalar value. If you've watched the earlier video that focuses on the structure of the while loop, you were probably left wondering a little bit about why you would even use a while loop instead of a for loop. Now, this video does not assume that you have any familiarity with for loops. If anything, what we would like to do is we'd like to embrace the fact that in a while loop, we want to run the condition an unknown number of times. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea is that with a while loop, it simply will continue until an expression is no longer true or till a condition is no longer true. In the earlier video, I gave the example of eating a bowl of cereal or eating a plate of pasta. The idea is that you would continue eating until you had finished the bowl or finished the plate. In this particular example, we are going to leverage that concept. I'm actually going to borrow a couple of functions in our examples that emphasize that you won't know up front how many times the loop should run. Instead, we want to control when the loop stops by carefully crafting that expression or condition. Now, for the first example, what I want to do is I want to be able to keep track of the balance in our checking account. Or, for instance, maybe you have some sort of debit card, and the idea is that we want to use this balance to drive how long the loop runs. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that balance to continue making some purchases. And specifically what we want to do is we want to use the randi function to demonstrate how we could be making random, perhaps unplanned purchases. In other words, you don't necessarily know at the beginning of the month what your meal purchases will be for that month or maybe for a week. Now, the idea here is that, again, much like in the earlier video, we want to start off with a balance. I'm going to keep the balance here low so that the loop doesn't run too many times, but you can sort of think of this as $100 in your checking account or in your debit card. And what we'd like to do now is we'd like to continue essentially purchasing things while our balance is greater than 0. And I'm going to be very specific here. I'm actually going to say that it has to be greater than and not equal to 0, because ideally, if you have $0 in your checking account, you shouldn't be out trying to purchase things. If anything, we'll see in a couple of examples, not only in this video, but in a later video, that we have to be careful about how we use this particular while loop, because as you'll see in just a second, I don't adequately handle this problem. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to identify a particular purchase that we'd like to make, and we're going to use a variable, purchase variable here, and we're simply going to leverage our randi function. If you've not worked with the randi function before, you'll know that basically what it does is it specifies an imax, and that the idea here is that you get values from 1 up to whatever that imax is. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying that we will be making purchases anywhere from $1 up to $10. And if you need a quick reminder of how the randi function works, well, you just simply come down here to the command window and you can specify then an example here, and you'll see that if I run this a couple of different times, I'll get a bunch of different values. Again, starting from 1 going up to 10. Now, we can make this more complicated if we want to. We can actually include our rand and our rand-n function to have a little bit more flexibility or a little more variability in our purchase. But for right now, we're going to stick to integer values. But keep in mind, these are, in fact, all doubles. Now, at this point, what I want to do is I simply want to use the purchase value, and I want to subtract it from the balance. And then at this point, then what we want to do is we simply want to display using our sprintf. Again, you can ignore the warning, or you can simply use the fprintf And what I'd like to do is I want to display not only the purchase, and what we'll do here is, in the spirit of recognizing that this is in fact supposed to be dollar amounts, I will use the %.2f. But we also want to display the balance. In other words, what the value is left over in your checking or in your debit card after you have made the purchase. And so in this case, we'll also get another %.2f. For that first placeholder, we're simply going to use the purchase. And then for that second placeholder, we will have our balance. At this point, this example should be pretty much ready to go unless we've got some typos. So let's go ahead and run this. Now, keep in mind, before you run this, I have no idea how many times this loop will run. And if anything, that's what we want to embrace. And so you'll see here that if I highlight, hit F9, or evaluate the expression, actually ran it a pretty good number of times here. As a matter of fact, you could start to see why I wanted to limit it to a value of 100, because if we got this too large, then it would probably run more than what would fit on the screen. And you can see here that my first purchase knocked it down to 98, my second purchase to 97, and my last purchase, which was $7, but I only had $1 in my account, drove my balance into the negative. Now you can probably start to see where the problem is in this particular approach. Now, we won't address that in this video. We just want to point it out. If anything, what I'd like to do is I simply want to highlight and rerun this another time. And you can see here that every time this while loop is essentially driven by the randi function, which subtracts that value then from the balance. And you can see here that in this case, I actually technically ran it more times than I did the previous iteration. And we can again run this again several times. And you can see here that we'll get a differing number of iterations of the loop. So we'll put this one on hold for just a second. We will pick this one up in another video, but if anything, what I'd like to do is I want to demonstrate yet another example here. In this case, I'm actually going to be using the input function for user input from the console, because again, this is a perfect example of some variability that you have no control over depending on what the problem is. In this case, what I want to do is I want to use the input from the user to drive how many times the while loop will run. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable called value, and I'm going to assign it a value of -1. Again, that value, that initial value, you'll see is somewhat arbitrary. However, we want to be careful and have a value that we can use then to ultimately drive the while loop. What I mean by that is we'll simply check to see while our value is not equal to 0. And again, this may run into some problems later on, but in this case, we're going to go ahead and leave it as we have it now. In other words, we're going to assume that whatever value is entered in by the user can be adequately compared to 0. We could also use a less than or equal criterion. Again, we've got a number of different possibilities here, but what we want to do is we simply want to capture the value. Goodness, how many times can I mistype this? There we go. Input is equal, value is equal to input. And then we have a nice prompt to the user. Please enter. Oh, goodness. I cannot believe the number of typos I'm making here. I promise I've had enough coffee here. Maybe I've had too much. Please enter a value, and then a colon followed by a space. Again, we can clean this up. We can make this look better. We can actually even separate this into a prompt using the display and an sprintf. But for now, this is going to be fine. And then what we want to do is we simply want to run this loop. In this case, since the user is going to be the controller of the condition or the expression in the while loop, we don't have to do any sort of incrementing or anything like that. I would like to go ahead and throw in an increment variable. In this case, we're going to go ahead and call it index. And this will simply keep track of how many times the loop has run. And in this case, we'll have our index is equal to index plus 1. And then finally, what we'll do is a display with an sprintf. And I simply want to keep track then of how many times I have ran the loop. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and use a %d for my index. And for the value, it doesn't really matter too much, but we'll go ahead and stick with our %.4f. And in that first placeholder, we'll have our index followed by our value. Again, I'm setting this one up for use in a later video so that we can see how to store the values. But right now, we basically just want to run this as many times as the user wants. And so in this case, we'll put in a value of 4, 5, 7, and then finally 0. And you'll notice that I'm returning control back to the Matlab editor. Now, let's take this just a tiny little bit further in that we can go ahead and keep track of the values. In this case, we're going to start off with a total. And then every time the user enters in a value, then what we want to do is we simply say total is equal to total plus whatever that value is. And then we can simply add this now to our display. And again, we're going to do a %.4f. And we will add then the total into this. And then probably the other thing that we want to do is to provide the user with a little bit of information on how to exit out of the loop. Please enter a value or 0 to exit. Again, this simply just helps the user out a little bit. And then we'll rerun this one more time. And we can again start off with just values here, 4, 7, and you can see that I'm printing out not only the value, but also the total. We can also include negative values because, again, remember our condition is only checking if we are, in fact, hitting enter. And you can see when I hit an enter, that'll be the final time for running the loop. Notice the total doesn't change. I did that kind of conveniently as an exit strategy out of our loop, so we wouldn't necessarily change the value of the total without using any sort of logic. So we got one last example in this one, and just again to see an alternate way of driving a loop. And in this particular case, what I want to do is I want to use a short piece of text. I'm actually going to just simply borrow some of the text from the Matlab Wikipedia article. If anything, you can just grab yourself a set of text. I'm going to call this contents. And again, we're going to be using a character vector. So I'll be using single quotes. Now, what I'd like to do is I would like to, again, leverage my index variable. I'm going to start off with index equal to 1 for this particular example. And I'm going to say, while my index is less than my length of my contents. And specifically what I want to do is I want to leverage less than or equal to. And the idea here is that I will simply loop through each of the contents characters and display them again using the sprintf. And I want to display not only the index, but I also want to display the character at that location in the contents. So in this case, contents, and what I'll do is I'll use a set of parentheses here, and then as the first placeholder will simply be the %d for the index. And then I want to follow that up with, in this particular case, is going to be a %c for that specific character. The first placeholder gets the index. The second placeholder gets the contents, parentheses, index. And again, we get the warning for the display in the sprintf. You can, of course, use fprintf if you want to. And then the last thing that we want to do is we want to remember to increment our index. Now, you'll notice that when I first started writing this loop out of habit, I went ahead and specified index equals to 0. Again, remember that Matlab is 1-based indexing and not 0-based indexing. so that you either have to start off at 1 or you simply increment before you actually try to utilize the index variable, or you have to play with some sort of shifting of the values. Again, those are topics that we can cover in later videos. I'm going to put a quick comment up here. And then what we can do is we can simply just run this, and you'll see that what I have done is I have simply printed out each of the individual characters along with this nice format here that shows you where they exist in the character vector, starting with the capital M for Matlab and continuing on to the lowercase e at the end of the word language, as well as all the other characters in between. So hopefully you found this video useful. These are 3 sort of completely different ways of using the while loop. There are many other ways of going about doing that, as we'll see in later videos, particularly when you start combining it with a little bit of logic. But as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.